Hey guys, welcome to my channel. My name is ReadingBear and I hope you are ready for some more stories. And today, we'll take a look at some new entitled people content. If you enjoyed my content, please don't forget to subscribe to my channel and post some bear emojis in the comment. And now, let's dive right into the stories.
The first story is titled, Karen Trespasses on My Property and Swims in My Lake. Parks her car on my private land. I'm Sam, and this is my very own lakeside horror story. For context, I used to live in Sarajevo, Bosnia and Herzegovina, as an investment banker before a series of good or lucky decisions changed my life and led to an early retirement. I left my home and moved to the remote countryside after absolutely falling in love with the house and its private lake. From here I often hosted parties on the lake over the summer months with visiting friends. What I did not account for so far in the wilderness was to encounter any neighbors, but surprisingly I did have a few. One family, which will come up a lot here so I will just call them the Smiths, that was not their real name obviously. I first met a few days after I moved in when they were randomly at my lake having a barbecue. A bit confused, but I didn't say anything at the time. I decided it would be a shame to try and keep the lake to myself, so I let people use it if they didn't break anything and took their trash away with them. The Smiths on the other hand often left piles of trash in their wake, sometimes even in the lake itself. Following on from a few bad incidents, I tried to talk to them about it as they were getting ready to go home, after another busy day of polluting. When I pointed out what they had been doing, they waved it off, claiming it wasn't their responsibility because they didn't own the lake. They drove off without finishing our conversation, and I knew at that point they couldn't be reasoned with. Their constant problem served to only remind me why I wanted to move out to the countryside and enjoy a quiet life. What should have been a friendly reminder of a closer community only added to a slowly growing frustration I struggled to keep bottled up. After a while it got too much, and I found myself driving back to Sarajevo for a sudden weekend getaway. I received a text message late Saturday from a different neighbor asking me about the party I was having on the lake. After a confused phone call we came to the conclusion that the Smiths were behind it, inviting a large group of people, which would no doubt result in mountains of trash and devastation. Despite the bad news, I thanked them for letting me know, and now soured by news back home, my holiday stopped and my plan for revenge began. As I returned to my lakeside retreat, I saw their car parked nearby, and after some unpacking I headed down there to meet them. The Smiths, as they always had been every time I saw them, were lounging around with some of the kids also splashing about in the lake. I maintained a friendly conversation as I peered around for signs of the party in the corners of my vision, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Perhaps this time they did tidy up to hide it a little. I did not bring it up and they did not mention it either. I did say, however, that I wanted my lake to be made more public and accessible, so I let them use it as often as they wished, which they were not as ecstatic about as I expected, perhaps because they already used the lake as if it were actually public. But to their credit, they did feign surprise quite well, and I did to my own surprise get a thank you out of the wife, whom from a number of previous encounters and observations I took to being the stern matriarch of the family. A few nights later I am disrupted from my TV time as something is forcefully thrown or shoved through my letterbox with the sounds of tires squealing into the distance as I move to investigate it. Resting on the doormat was an invitation to a big party the Smiths were planning to host for friends and family on the lake. Glancing down I noted the date as well. Perfect, I thought to myself with a cunning smile. Now I could put my next plan into action as I set to prepare for their arrival. As the promised day finally arrived, I practically jumped out of bed that morning, eager to get things underway. First, I sent a text message to the Smiths to say I was feeling sick and did not want anyone else to catch it. Second, I set out wooden planks and twigs in rows to simulate a parking area that the guests would hopefully use, because under the spaces I had buried boards of nails to puncture their tires with. Hopefully their tires at least. If my plan goes terribly wrong and someone stood on it, I knew I would be the one in trouble instead. Luckily I can say my plan went off without a hitch. I sat by my upstairs window with a pair of binoculars and a bowl of chips as one watched the fleet of cars arrive at the lake, pulling into their assigned slots like perfectly planned puzzle pieces. If anyone had noticed as their cars slowly dropped a few inches, no one gave any indication as they hauled kegs and crates over to a small picnic area set out for them. As the party got fully into swing I waited, ready to set up my third and final plan for total revenge. I was temporarily taken aback by my sheer maliciousness and calculating cold nature. but flashes of bad memories caused by the Smiths as well as a desolate lake in the very near future removed any doubts I had. As the party began to get quieter, I swung into action. Grabbing a pile of crude homemade signs, I quickly made my way over the lake and hammered them around the area in clear view of the car park. Just for added measure, I uncovered the nailboards as well, so that it would look as if they had been visible the whole time as a warning they had ignored when they arrived. As I heard people beginning to make their exits from the party, I snuck away to resume watching them from my house instead. When I had gotten back to my perch, there was now a growing crowd of confused people looking between the large, "No trespassing" signs that had seemed to ominously appear around them in their absence. Hurrying to leave, they didn't even notice their flat tires until they started their cars, which only added to the chaos and confusion of their party. Not long after, I get a hurried knocking at the door from Karen Smith. Half torn between panic and anger, she accused me of ruining her party. I replied that she was on private land and using a private lake, warning her that I'd call the cops if she made that mistake again. The group outside shuffled back down the road to the nearest house. The next morning, a tow truck came and dragged each car away until it was empty, and I was alone again, just me and my lake. I never did see the Smiths again, and I'm all the happier for it. The next story is titled, "Retired Neighbors Make Life Hell for Spouse and Me." My wife and I work opposite shifts, with her going into work early morning and getting home in time for us to hug, kiss, and then I'm out the door for my job that takes me past midnight. I also work rotating weekends and am on call during bad weather. We have 3 children, the oldest just finished pre-K, so they are not old enough to be on their own. In the rainy season, our grass gets pretty long because in order for mowing to get done, both of us have to be home, so this usually gets done every other week, and that's if it doesn't also happen to be storming. So, there are times the grass gets crazy. Both of our neighbors on either side of us are retired. They have all the time in the world to care for their lawn, but they hire people to do it for them anyway, and they look immaculate. Our lawn, aside from the length, is free of weeds. Bermuda grass tends to choke everything else out, and is overall taken care of. So, our neighbors, because they have nothing better to do, will call the city and report our lawn's unsightly length 2 or 3 times a month to try and motivate us to keep it cut. And we're talking the day after I let it go for a week because I happened to be on call that weekend. Now I have spoken with both of my neighbors about the time constraints that my wife and I have. It'd be one thing if we didn't have kids, or if they were older and my wife and I could go out and mow when we have the time. But this has fallen on deaf ears. My typical work week is about 50+ hours in busy crunch time, which, of course, also occurs in the rainy, mowing season, but I assure them that when it's a clear day and we're both home, the yard work gets done. This of course falls on deaf boomer ears. One of them called me lazy and that when they were young and married with kids, they worked 3 jobs and made it work, and I just don't take pride in caring for my lawn and blah blah blah. Another one suggested that I mow during the day while my wife is gone and let the kids run around in the yard while I do so. Yes, that sounds totally safe. No way a 5, 3, and 2-year-old are in any danger while I'm pushing a mower with a spinning blade. There was one time I was trimming with my kids outside and our 2-year-old comes up and tries to stick his hand into the trimmer. Yeah, no, they need to be watched over while one of us is mowing. So of course, I was angry at their response. But being a Midwestern American used to Midwest passive aggression, I got an idea. I'm just going to convert our backyard and alley into a garden. We're talking hanging gardens of Babylon, levels of ostentatious. The tallest, bushiest, and vine-wiest plants I can find. We're talking pumpkins, sunflowers, corn, watermelons, berries, lavender. Even getting some stinky plants like onions, garlic, globemaster, or cleome, which benefit the garden because they attract bees and hummingbirds and repel leaf-eating pests. The garden is going to be a thick boy, surpassing any length or bushy levels my grass ever got. The added benefit is, while it's a lot of work to start up, going out and pulling weeds is something safe I can totally do during the day with the kids running around in the yard. Our fences on either side are chain link, so all the smelly plants and tall bois are going right alongside the property line of the neighbors. I'm calling it my spike garden. Everything will have labels like curb appeal cucumbers, and these peppers are permitted, and my personal favorites, jack-off motion jalapenos, and the raspberries labels are a picture of someone blowing a raspberry, courtesy of my artistic wife. There is no city ordinance on gardens other than they cannot be in the front lawn, and as long as I keep it maintained and weeded, there is nothing the neighbors can do. The next story is titled, "You Want the Police Involved?" Okie dokie. So, the day after Christmas about 10 years ago, my brother called me up and asked me for some assistance setting up some of his new computer equipment. He lived down the road from a store that specialized in discount china, so naturally it was extremely busy. Busy as in, cars were parked everywhere, including on the grass in front of the store, and it was impossible to see around the corner if someone wanted to pull out of the furthest exit. Unfortunately, the speed limit, 50 miles per hour, is also extremely high on the road as well, even if you have to really try to accelerate to get to 50 miles per hour by the time you pass the store. So, I decided to play it safe and was doing roughly half the speed limit, perhaps 30 miles per hour, while going around the corner of this store. Even at this speed, of course some guy decided to pull out without checking, and I couldn't stop in time to avoid hitting him. Now, I was driving an older Mitsubishi that already had some damage, and he had a small dent in his fender. And, come on, it's still Christmas, right? So, I get out of the car, take a look at the damage, and turn around to see a furious, older, red-faced gentleman in front of me. Right after I tell him that it doesn't really look like much damage, so there's no need to contact the police, he proceeds to scream in my face about how I was speeding, and this is all my fault. Oh no honey. A young woman driving by herself may appear to be easily intimidated, but I was trying to be nice. If you want the police involved, let's do it buddy. I call the non-emergency line, explain there was a very minor car accident, and that the other driver was insisting that it was my fault, so I would feel better if the police were involved. The dispatcher got my information, stopped for a moment, and then quietly thanked me for calling the appropriate number. 911 was hardly necessary, and told me that she also felt it would be safer for me if the police were dispatched. After a 30-minute wait, an officer showed up to the scene. I, not being a total moron, sat quietly in my car and waited for him to come over to me. The other driver felt it was necessary to leap out of his vehicle and run over to the officer and start screaming and gesturing wildly. I didn't catch what was said, but I did see the look on the cop's face, and I was getting more and more amused. After being clearly told to get back into his car, the cop came over to me and asked me what happened. I told him what was going on, and that not only had I not deliberately sped up to go the speed limit, but I had also actually slowed down because of how busy the business was. He nodded and went back to measure the skid marks on the road, and confirmed he believed I was actually doing about 25 and complimented my thinking on safe driving in this specific situation. He then proceeded to write the other driver a ticket, and the other driver pulled out of the parking lot a second time, with his window down, flipping me off. At this point, the cop came over to me, explained that he wrote it up as the other driver's fault for more than $1,000 due to the damage on his fender. He also stated that, "Darlin', I don't say this often, but I believe you should take that man's insurance company for every dime you can get. Thanks for insisting we call the police." The next story is titled, My Uncle and the Fence. Where I live, the fence put up by the builder and on the property line is called a builder's fence. To replace or repair the fence you need both owners' consent in writing. My uncle's house has two such fences on either side of the property. The fences were old and because of the size of the fences were cost prohibitive to replace. The year this happened in was very rainy and the fence collapsed in one section. Now uncle takes pride in his property and had been trying for years to get permission from his neighbor to repair it. The day after the fence collapsed, the neighbor came over and screamed at my uncle that he had to replace the fence because that the thing was an eyesore. My uncle was pissed, but because the fence was now dangerous, he agreed if the neighbor covered half the materials totaling about $1,000. The neighbor did not agree and said, "You're going to replace the fence and use my contractor or I'm going to call my cousin in the city, by law compliance, and he'll make you replace it." My uncle told him to call the city and slammed the door in his face. Of course, a by-law official shows up a few days later and give my uncle a notice that he had to replace or remove the fence in a month or be fined. After carefully questioning the official and was told that it is only required to have a fence around your property if you have a pool. So, the day before reinspection my uncle and cousins took it down. The neighbor freaked out and screamed at my uncle that he had to replace it because he had a pool. My uncle looked him dead in the eye and said, "Not my problem. I'm in full compliance with the city just like you wanted." I found out because I went over with my mom to hang out and were greeted with sight of the neighbor trying to pour concrete footings in the rain. The last story is titled, Uproot the Hedge? Let's just double check. My grandmother lives in a city neighborhood where the houses are fairly close to each other. She has always had a problem with her sour neighbor complaining about one thing or another. So, one day her neighbor notifies her that she believes that the hedge running down the property line separating the two driveways is on her land and she wants my grandmother to cut it down. Seems a little stupid as the hedge provides a small amount of privacy between the two homes and benefits both parties. So, my grandmother has no choice but to comply with her wish, but first she hires a surveyor to come and determine exactly where the property line is. Turns out that the hedge is indeed on my grandmother's property. It also reveals that the neighbor's garage is 2 feet over the property line onto my grandmother's property. The look on her neighbor's face when she gets the report and is informed that she has to tear down her garage was worth the price of the survey. They eventually settled, and in the interest of peace my grandmother allowed her to buy the land on her property for several $1,000s. Thank you for listening.